Every year they come from all over Vermont, from the smaller towns and the larger cities. Some of them farmers, some of them lawyers, doctors, store clerks, but all of them elected representatives of their local communities. And they meet in Montpelier to govern. Join me now as Adelphia Cable Communications takes us inside the State House. One of the fun things about producing a television program from the State House here is that sometimes you come and you know what you want to talk about and who you want to talk with. Another fun part of it is, though, is just coming and you never know quite who you'll run into. And very fortunate today to run into Paul Poirier. Paul, it's good to see you again. What have you been doing the last few weeks?
Well, trying to stay out of trouble.
That's a full-time job
yeah,
sometimes.
It is. Yeah, it's actually, I've been, in my working capacity for Green Mountain Power now, I've been involved in a lot of promotion for our Hydro-Quebec contract that we have before the Public Service Board. We've had the public hearing process going on, and I've been spending a lot of time traveling around the state, speaking to various groups about the merits of Hydro-Quebec to the state of Vermont in our long-term energy planning.
I've noticed your name in the press a couple of times recently. Once, just recently, I noticed that you're elected alderman in the city of Barrie.
Well, that's true. I mean, some people have said, how long is he going to stay out of politics? And I've always been interested in politics at the local level. And in my community, there are just some exciting things happening in terms of merging Barrie City, Barrie Town, getting prepared as we draw up our planning for Act 200 and where we want our community to go. And so I decided to seek elective office at the local level, and I ran for the city council and got elected.
The other time recently that I remember seeing your name in the press is in terms of the candidate that you've come out and decided to back in terms of the U.S. House race. Maybe you can tell us about what entered into your decision regarding that.
Well, I recently came out and publicly said that, in the fall elections for Congress that I'm going to support Peter Smith. And it was a decision that I'd given a lot of thought to. Other people have different reasons for endorsing candidates. And what I really looked at it as for me, it was a candidate. My decision was based on what I thought was right for the state of Vermont and what was right for the Democratic Party at this particular time. I ran against Peter and Bernie Sanders in the last congressional elections, got to know them both. Have high personal regards for both of them as individuals. They have their own personal philosophies, but to me it gets down to a couple of things. One is Peter Smith has done a decent job in his first term, and he's supported issues that, quite frankly, he kind of was on the other side of during the campaign. They're issues that were important to me: affordable child care. He voted against the Republican position and supported the Democratic position, which was the ABC child care bill, which is something that I was advocating during the last congressional campaign. He came out and supported and broke ranks with the Republican on minimum wage. He has voted to decrease military spending, and he's put an emphasis on education. So, I think if you take a look and you take away the party labels that people have, and you take a look, for me, was to looking at, here we have a person who's in there, he's established himself, and in this particular election, is it worth removing that person and bringing in somebody, again, completely new? That was one of my decisions. The second decision was really a personal thing, is that, there have been a lot of overtures made to Bernie Sanders to run as a Democrat, or to join the Democratic Party, and bring our agendas together, and Bernie has always scoffed at those. And I, as an individual, just, as a Democrat, just can't, justify taking 10 years of abuse for a party that I think has done a heck of a good job, and then putting that all behind us and saying that I forget everything you said about it and let's kiss and make up. So that for me was a personal decision, and so I am going to work to help Peter Smith get reelected, and who knows, in 2 years from now I may be working hard to get him unelected. But you have to look at this election as what I think is right for my party and for the state of Vermont. I would add that I had spoken with Dolores Sandoval before Dolores made her announcement, and tried to convince Dolores not to run. But she made a decision to go forward again, and I wish her well. But my decision was based on what I thought I had to do.
So your current position, is it based on the fact that you've already announced, or is it based on the fact that you still believe that Peter would be a better representative than Dolores?
Well, I think I think Dolores, if she were elected, she'd be a very good representative for Vermont. I mean, she supports again, the issues that I care about. But I think you have to take a look at it is, having run for Congress and knowing what you need to be successful in there. It's not just being good ideas. It's a sad commentary in our society, but you'd better have the megabucks to be able to get that message out there. And I ran when I won the Democratic primary and ran last time. I had a good base of working from in terms of helping the poor, the elderly, the working people, and everything else. And I was proud of everything I did for those particular groups of people. But those are also the groups of people that don't have access to a lot of money. And I was heavily outspent by both Peter and Bernie the last campaign. And as I looked at it, Dolores, she doesn't even have that base to start with. So, I mean, I just don't. Dolores is going to have a very difficult time getting her message out there.
So it's not a question of being anti-Sandoval, it's a question of who's electable?
Exactly, that's the way it is. I mean, I would say that Dolores Sandoval, if she had the base to operate from and had the finances to operate out there, would be a very articulate candidate for any office.
I know that labeling is not necessarily good, particularly in Vermont political politics, but there's some that may look at Peter Smith's record and say that he's done so well by the Democratic Party and has the support of so many Democrats like yourself. They're really not a very good Republican.
Well, I think, Peter, one of the things that Peter Smith did in Washington, and quite frankly, it surprised me, and I'm glad it happened, is Peter went to Washington and established his independence, which I think is number one, is crucial. I think even if you were the Democrat and you got elected there, you have to remember, we only have one representative in Washington, and that person has to be able to deal with literally the Republicans, the Democrats, the liberal conservative efforts, and you got to bring back the benefits. And Peter went to Washington and he established his independence. He broke with the Bush administration's, I think he has the third largest number of anti-Bush votes within the Republican Party.
Does that illustrate what I'm saying?
Yes, it does. And I think that, Peter I'm sure has a basic philosophy on, the way that the Republican Party is, and that is maybe reduce taxes, get more money down. I haven't talked to him about that. I mean, he supported the capital gains tax, which I probably would say I wish he had voted the other way on it. He was there for the debate, I wasn't. But overall, I think it's important that we have independence in Washington, and I think he's demonstrated that.
I want to come back and ask you about Paul Poirier's plans, but first, one more question about Peter Smith. Then I promise we'll leave him alone. What about the National Rifle Association? Very upset at Peter. What do you think about his stand there?
Well, it's interesting. I had a lot of support from the National Rifle Association in the last campaign, financially, and helping me win the primary. And I think everybody, with the exception of Bernie Sanders, everybody who went before them basically had the same philosophy, which was that, the current laws that we have on the books today are adequate and we ought to be enforcing them. Peter's position on the assault weapon, is something that I don't look at as that he broke any promise. I mean, I don't know of any sportsman who can justify and will tell you, I don't know why we even need these assault weapons. I think it's more of a fear that this is only the first step. You've opened up the door a little. And, I mean, I don't see that coming from Peter. I mean, I think Peter is committed to his position that, the right to bear arms means that. But, at the same time, that doesn't mean everybody should have an open machine gun. So, I mean, I think Peter's going to take some flack there. But obviously, I think from the people who look at this issue, I mean, they're going to look at, is Bernie going to be any different in that position? I mean, I could see Bernie's position being, at least you know where I stand for up front. And there'll be some people who feel that Peter has, betrayed them. They won't support him. But I think for the average sportsman in the state, and I've talked to a lot of people who belong to the Berry Fish and Game Club, the largest one in the state, a lot of them think Peter Smith was right in his statement that he came out on.
Paul, you've been here and now you're gone, and yet you're still here lobbying and working and so forth. What do you think? You think you may want to be back here again sometime?
Well, I'll tell you, I've missed the State House a lot. I mean, I'm here, but it's in kind of a different capacity. I still have a lot of friends here. I'm seriously considering running in the fall for a seat in the Vermont General Assembly. Just a couple of things I have to work out, personal things, but if I had to make the decision today, based on what I know, I would announce that I'm re-entering to get elected back and represent my community.
Not a political statement one way or another, just our friendly best wishes and whatever you choose to do. Thank you for talking with us.
Well, thank you. It was my pleasure, and nice to see you all again.
Good to see you, Paul. One of the most interesting groups of people here in the State House is actually not representatives and not the senators, but lobbyists. What is a lobbyist? What do they do? Well, rather than me tell you, let me introduce you to Jeanne Klobnak. Did I get that right?
Yes.
Jeanne, what is it that lobbyists do here in the State House?
Well, they do a variety of things. Generally, they provide the legislators with information about the issues of concern to the organizations they represent. In addition to that, they try to persuade the legislators to vote the way they want them to on the issues of concern to the interests that they represent.
What are some of the interests that you represent?
I represent the Lake Champlain Committee, which is concerned with the protection and enhancement of the Lake Champlain and its tributaries. The Lake Champlain Basin represents all but 4 counties in Vermont, and it borders New York and also Quebec, or Canada. And there are a lot of conflicting user interests associated with the lake, a lot of pollution problems about which we don't even have basic information yet. So we're trying to get that information.
Is there a particular bill that you want to see passed or defeated?
Yes, right now we're working on a bill, S290, which would basically establish a 14-member committee on Lake Champlain. And the committee would be directed to study problems associated with the conflicting uses on Lake Champlain, pollution, and in addition it would take motorboat fee, percentage of motorboat fees that are paid every year and allocate those to the Agency of Natural Resources to be used for the purposes under S290.
I'd like to talk just for a minute about lobbyists or about lobbying. I know that you prefer, or that your folks that you work for prefer to have you called a legislative liaison. Now, why is that?
It has a nicer ring to it. It's much more suave, and you know, when you hear the word lobbyist, it just sounds sort of hard.
As I read it, the general public, there may be a kind of an image of a lobbyist as someone who's involved perhaps in favors or maybe even bribes, twisting arms and kind of persuading legislators almost in a kind of an indecent way. Do you ever get a kind of a negative connotation to the word lobbyist?
Well, I think an important distinction has to be made between lobbyists who are lobbying for profitable reasons and lobbyists who are lobbying for nonprofit reasons. And I'm a nonprofit lobbyist, and so I don't think that connotation has been necessarily associated with me. I think that it has been associated with a lot of big business lobbyists, perhaps because it may in some ways be true.
Jeanne, I don't imagine there's a bachelor's degree for lobbying, although perhaps a political science degree would help. What training is it that you find was helpful in your lobbying?
I think basically it just comes with being around the legislative process, understanding how the legislative process works, understanding how to decipher through a lot of information and get to the bottom of it and know what's important and what's not. It requires a certain degree of speaking and writing abilities, but anybody could be a lobbyist. I mean, you don't have to have any specific training.
Thank you for taking a few minutes to chat with us. In the second half of today's program, UVM political science professor Frank Bryan will debate with Vermont Supreme Court Justice John Dooley the question, should Vermont secede from the Union? We'll be right back. Wednesday evening this week, the House chamber was filled to capacity as a crowd gathered there to hear the 7th and final debate in a series sponsored by the Vermont Bicentennial Committee. Listen now to a condensed version of the arguments of Frank Bryan for secession and those of Justice John Dooley in opposition.
My case tonight is called a Patriot's Case for Secession. Patriot's Case for Secession. Let me read you the hypothesis. After 200 years of participation in the American democratic experience, the United States needs a sharp slap in the face. It needs to be slapped out of its complacency. A slap only the secession of this state from the Union can provide. And a century hence, people will say of us, Americans will say of us, thank you, Vermont, we needed that. That we must ask in the affirmative if my case is to prevail. And now, I will go through these 5 questions. Number 1, does Vermont have the character to be a nation? Is it in our guts? Let me share with you the words of Gentleman Johnny Burgoyne as he came down Lake Champlain attacking the new American Republic, 1777. Picture him on that blue lake, green mountains on either side, Vermont to the left, New York to the right, coming down that lake with his flotilla. And he said then in his diary, Vermont is a country that abounds in the most active and rebellious race on the continent and hangs like a gathering storm on my left. That early description of Vermont is apt today. There is no state in this union that is more nationalistic than Vermont. From the very beginning, we have been a wayward, ornery, cussed state. Question number 2, has the federal government violated its contract? Baby, has it ever violated its contract? If you were to read the debates over the question of joining the Union that were held 200 years ago, you would be absolutely convinced that every single person that spoke would now vote against staying in the Union. They would vote for getting out. Those arguments are clear. Federal government has fundamentally violated that contract. Listen to the words with me of Thomas Jefferson. He said, I hold it that a little rebellion now and then is a good thing and is necessary to the body politic as to the political world as storms are to the physical world. Got to have rebellion now and then. It's healthy. And listen to the words of Benjamin Franklin, who said, anyone that would sacrifice liberty for security deserves neither. Question number 3, is history on our side? It would be kind of silly to do this if we were riding the horse in the direction the horse isn't going, as Robert Nisbet once said. Secession of Vermont will be leading the world, the globe, from North America in a radical movement of decentralism. As the 20th century was a century of centralism, the 21st century will be a century of diffusion, deconcentration, and decentralism. And the computer and information technology will be the motor force for that decentralism, much as the automobile was the motor force for centralism of the 20th century. Listen to the words of Michael Daniels, who said in vital speeches just last month, a leading Democratic pollster recently emerged from a series Democratic pollster of focus groups to say, quote, people were not expressing pro or anti-Washington views, they just didn't care. Washington is not a factor in their consciousness. He had glimpsed the future. Dave Broder of the Washington Post says the same thing. He says the new anti-Washington feeling is much worse than it's ever been because it's not anger, it's just that people really don't care anymore. Question number 4, is the situation bad enough? Is the situation bad enough to call for secession? Listen to the words of Calvin Coolidge that are inscribed on the very walls of this building. If liberty should vanish in other parts of the nation, and if the support for our institutions might languish, it could all be restored from the ample store held by that brave little state of Vermont. Vermont is the state, the only state that can do that because, in fact, the situation's bad enough. Now, for First of all, in terms of governmental structure, the American presidency is in twilight. It's been in twilight since the 1960s. The American presidency, the American president, which can no longer deal with the bureaucracy. I would love to read you some, maybe I can in the rebuttal, quotes of every single president from Roosevelt on, talking about how it's impossible for them to do anything about domestic policy. Secondly, the Congress is brain dead. I don't know of an American political scientist who would not agree with that. The Congress does not know what it is doing. Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, a favorite senator of mine, said it in 1969 in his book, Maximum Feasible Misunderstanding. He said, the Congress doesn't know what it is doing. What does the Congress do? It gives all complicated policy to the bureaucracy. It's too complicated for them. They subdelegate that. Any question of has any ethical content at all, except for their own behavior, they then give to the Supreme Court because they don't want to deal with that either. They know it's a trap. They don't want to deal with it. And by the way, bioethical policy will be the major policy construct of the next century, and we have a Congress without the guts to even begin to discuss those things because they're afraid no matter what they'll say, they'll lose votes. So with ethical policy gone to the court, complicated policy gone to the bureaucracy, what's left? Getting reelected and also talking about their own little scandals till they bore us all to death, and there are lots of those. That seems to be one thing that they can do, is provide us with those kinds of things to talk about. The United States Supreme Court is making policy which it doesn't want to make because neither other of the branches of government they can do it. You can't knock the Supreme Court for taking an active role, whether you're conservative or liberal, when nobody else will do it. But the court ought not to be making some of the kinds of decisions it's making. But it has to make them. There's no way to make public policy. Secondly, in terms of policy, look, we all can handle federal silliness. And we've had federal silliness forever, and we always will. What we can't put up is bare-bone, raw waste. There's nothing that bothers a Vermonter more than waste. Let me try to put this waste thing into perspective for you very quickly. If you add together, by the way, this doesn't come from inefficiency, and it doesn't even come too much from evil. It comes from waste. If you add up all the waste caused by macro-bureaucratic decision-making in the HUD scandals, the FMHA scandals, and the savings and loan scandals, it will take Vermont until the year 2051 to pay for that waste if every dime of every single Vermonter's income tax goes towards that all throughout that period. So as you make up your income tax this year, remember every dime you're paying, as we used to say over in Newbury, is sand down a rat hole, and it will be sand down a rat hole for the next 60 years. Now that's immoral. See? That's waste that we cannot condone. Hey. Finally, can we get away with it? Vermonters are very, very practical people, and there's no sense in trying unless we can get away with it. Listen with me to the words of Bernard DeVoto, one of the most incandescent quotes ever made about Vermont. Bernard DeVoto, great American historian, once said, "There's no more Yankee than Polynesian in me. There's no more Yankee than Polynesian in me. I'm a flatlander. I'm not a Yankee. There's no more Yankee than Polynesian in me. But when I travel towards Vermont, I feel like I'm going towards my home place." Neil Pearce once said, "Vermont was the only state you can feel homesick for before you even leave it." What does he mean? When you're in Vermont, you feel homesick for America. We are the American conscience. We are the quintessential American homeland. All Americans know that if it works in Vermont, it works. That's why town meeting's so important. That's why our nuclear freeze referendum in 1982 had such power, because this was the heartland of Vermont. I can tell you this, the American people are not going to let George Bush run tanks into Bennington. I promise you that. We have a window of opportunity of a couple or 3 years. All we've got to do is have the courage to stand and do it, and this country's going to let us get away with it, and I say they're going to cheer us on. And if they don't, we'll cut off their Ben and Jerry's.
Letters. We got a letter from a gentleman by the name of James Drake in Milledgeville, Georgia. Mr. Drake writes as follows. I read with great interest the article in today's Macon, Georgia Telegraph and News concerning Vermont's debate on secession. As a piece of unsolicited advice, I offer the following. You may have heard of an organization called the Confederate States of America, of which my state is a former member. And as for secession, forget about it. We tried it and it didn't work out too well. Remember that. I always start this debate in the posture that Frank Bryan puts me in. I empty my mind, I become... I'm sorry, that slipped up. I open my mind. I become one of Professor Bryan's students. And what I find in there is a quote from H.L. Mencken that gives me an overview, I think, of this issue. His quote is, to every problem, there is a solution. Neat, simple, and wrong. He indicated about that debate that everybody who participated in it, if they knew what they knew now, would vote to secede. I don't think so. Did we get what we were promised? You bet we did. Let's talk about domestic tranquility. In this room, there are persons of Irish descent like me, and there are Italians and French and Polish and German and Chinese and Japanese and probably many others that I didn't remember. In your country of origin, these differences tore your ancestors asunder. Let's talk about the United States Constitution first. I can give no better argument than that given by Senator John McClaughry. Is he? He wrote me a letter after listening to the St. Johnsbury debate in which this point was made, and let me read you his letter. I think it's very instructive on this point. I am not prepared to relinquish the protection of the United States Constitution, leaving myself exposed to the grasping, liberty-threatening government featuring as governor your friend Madeline Kunin, a left-wing legislature controlled by Ralph Wright, and the Supreme Court, which I understand to be largely under your sinister influence.
The question is, shall Vermont secede from the Union?